So, Mr. Williams, sir, I'm not going to let you off this easy. We're talking about someone like Tolkien, who is obviously the writer who you wrote in the tradition of and up against. And I would like you to be a bit more specific in what was going on in your mind when you decided, I can do this, but I don't want to do the same thing. I want to do something of my own. It kind of going to sound a bit like Tolkien. People will put me on the same shelf with him, but I want to be Ted Williams. And this happened.
I'll try to keep this brief because that brings out a two-part answer. The first part is that it was never Tolkien that I was reacting to. J.R.R. Tolkien made his world out of things that meant something to him, that he chose to make his world from. He took a great deal of bits from different parts of folklore. He took his elves from the Norse, the Scandinavian mythologies. He took his dwarves from the Germanic and Norse mythologies. He took his men from Anglo-Saxon poetry, and there are all kinds of things he picked from. But, even more importantly, he brought in elements of himself as well. J.R.R. Tolkien was a very different writer than I am, say, for instance, a different person from a different place. He was Catholic, and fairly strongly Catholic. The idea of the fallen world, which of course is a strong part of Christian mythology and Judeo-Christian mythology, was very important in his work. And the whole idea that the world had been better than it is now, and it will continue to diminish in some ways, lose some of its glory and magic. That's very Tolkien. That's also very much from his background. His dislike of the modern world in Oxford. He never got used to cars in Oxford. He wasn't really crazy about electric lights either. That's fine. I have no problem with that. That's him bringing himself into his books in a way that gives them that profound feeling of bittersweetness and loss that we all respond to in The Lord of the Rings. However, the people who came along in the wake of Tolkien oftentimes took those things as though they were holy writ and simply did them all over again with slight differences. So I've often said it's like if every detective story writer after Conan Doyle, if their main character had to be a coke-sniffing, violin-playing, kind of semi-sociopath like Sherlock Holmes, and that was the only kind of detective you could have. That was Conan Doyle's choice, and it was a brilliant character, which is why people still care about it today. So, my reaction was not so much to Tolkien, although I did in the Dragon Bone Chair books try to point out some of the ways in which I saw things differently. So my characters are introduced to the idea of a golden age with the Scythi, who are the immortals of that world. And then when he starts to scrape the surface and learn more, he begins to discover that all was not so golden, that there were dark secrets and things that were shameful even in the Scythi background. And that's because I'm a post-Vietnam, post-Watergate person, I don't have any part of me that believes the world was always better than it is now. No, absolutely not. And I have now lived through enough of it officially to tell you, yes, some great things happened in the 60s, but there was a lot of crap going on in the 60s and the 50s and the 70s and every other era. And anybody who feels like, God, I wish I lived back then, trust me, every era is what it is. It's got good and it's got bad. Now, the second part to that question, see, I answer questions like I write books in volumes. The second answer to that question is, therefore, when I finished the Dragon Bone Chair series, which, as I said, I intended in part to be a commentary on what was going on in fantasy, and which, as you noted, reviewers absolutely missed. They were like, a pretty good Tolkienian, blah, blah, blah. And not a single one of them seemed to notice I was telling them what their business should be. Then after I finished those books, I wanted to do something very different. I still wanted to play around in the fields of fantasy, but I wanted to write a book that nobody would say was Tolkienian. There was another semi-Tolkien imitation. And that's why I wrote the Other Land books. I wanted to write an epic fantasy that could only have been written by somebody with my background in my time, during my history. I had a lot of experience with this stuff from the brief time that I worked at Apple in the early days of virtual reality, which we then called interactive multimedia. And I wanted to use that as the basis for a big, sprawling, epic fantasy. So try to cross those two worlds of the present and the coming future that I lived in with this form that I loved, which goes, all the way back to the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that was the second part of it. As I said, I'm going to write something that nobody will say, oh, he's just ripping off Tolkien. No, there weren't any flying children monkey avatars in Tolkien, as far as I know. So